Let's say that one of our learners out there has kind of a classical economics or finance background, and they're listening and they're saying, okay, he's making a case that integrating ESG and these types of mitigating factors will generally lead companies to perform better. And they're thinking, then why are you necessary? Why are these ratings companies, the indices, all this research necessary? It does, from a classical perspective, seem like it's a huge inefficiency in the system. And I'll go back as a lawyer. I came out during the post-Enron era many, many years ago, but this is like 2003, 4, 5, and they created the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which created a massive amount of required reporting, et cetera. And one of the big differences, which I'll point out, is that was legally mandated versus what we're talking about here, which is largely not. But 15, 20 years on, one of the biggest criticisms is that type of regulation and that type of reporting just made lawyers and accountants very rich. It didn't actually necessarily make companies better. And so for the cynics out there who are saying, okay, if these types of behaviors will lead to better companies that will be more profitable, let the market take care of itself. We don't need these indices. We don't need these types of ratings. Again, how would you respond to them, and what is the role of ratings and indices from an ESG perspective for those investors who are out there?
Okay. So I'm gonna stay away from regulation now, but
Sure.
I'm sure we're gonna get to it later. So because as you mentioned, some of these regulatory initiatives, it's not like we are not seeing the same in the sustainability space. But
especially around like reporting certain types of things.
Exactly.
There's many examples. Yeah.
Exactly. But now maybe more specifically to ratings and indices that are, you could say, voluntary. They are just as I mentioned, they are tools to help investor in their decision making process, right? To make better or well informed decisions, right? So and how do they achieve that, right? Either ratings or indices. So when we are talking about ratings, I would say that the biggest maybe advantage of the ratings from an investor or the consumer of the rating point of view is the comparability, right? Because of course, as you mentioned, like if these things are good, companies would act on them, I guess investors would act on them. Why are we necessary, right? It's simply about the data, right?
Yeah.
So whereas maybe in the past, data was a problem, right? Like it was very difficult to get relevant information on definitely sustainability topics, but even some other things. I would say now the problem is the opposite, that there's too much data
Sure.
out there, right? It's difficult to orientate, right?
Yeah.
So what a tool such as rating does, whether it's MSCI ESG rating or it can be even credit ratings that maybe people are more familiar with, is that they compare companies on the same criteria, right? Of course, there are some adjustments there, as I mentioned. Maybe you then finally compare them relative to their industry peers. Maybe some of them have these absolute numbers, or some absolute comparison that they would, just really use just the same criteria and whatever comes out of there. But that's less important. But that they are built. The rating is built in the same way, right? So it's consistent and comparable across markets. Because you can imagine that if you are looking at companies and their sustainability, and we're gonna look at the German company, Indian company, Chinese company, and a US company, we're gonna probably see something very different, right? In terms of their reporting, in terms of what they say, what they do, and all of that. For you as a global investor, that's almost impossible to navigate, right? Not impossible, but very difficult, right? Because you need to, be able to translate all of these differences into kind of a unified view, right? So simply speaking, what we do is do this work for you, right?
Yeah.
In a rating, that the AAA oil and gas company in the US is comparable to a AA or single A oil and gas company in Germany, right, and in China, and you can make your decision, based on that. But you have this basic frame of reference.
And I imagine that's especially important for these areas that people are increasingly concerned about, but it's much more difficult to get information, especially around the S and the G, especially the S, where a lot of it is fairly qualitative and require like literal just digging into these companies to get that information, because it's not very quantifiable and there aren't a lot of reporting requirements on those things. So basically, a company like yours can go in, do a lot of that groundwork in hopefully a way that is at least kind of similar across companies in these different industries.
No, absolutely. As you mentioned, it's also processing that huge amount of data, and a lot of it is qualitative. So really going through different, financial reports, sustainability reports, any kind of publicly available source, because we only work with publicly available sources. But also then maybe I would go back to what we talked about, that kind of quantifying of qualitative data, right? So again, does every investor want to maybe do this work on their own, which also includes deciding or what are these relevant thresholds, or
right.
or do they maybe want someone else to do it? Of course, support that with enough evidence and research to back up why it makes sense or not. Again, maybe mention some, let's say, diversity numbers, or it can be also things like, let's say, talking qualitative about the workforce, seeing maybe the turnover at the company, right? Like how often do employees come and go, which, every hiring manager knows that it can be a problem, right? You need to train people, kind of there needs to be that continuity, right? So again, like we can test maybe, from which kind of level does the turnover at the company start to be a problem, right? Because every company will go through some employee turnover, but if it's above 10%, 20%, 30% a year, right? You can imagine that at some point it starts to be a big problem, right?
Yep.
So we also, study all of these things, and of course then, can present it to investors, and they can make their mind, if that makes sense or not. And again, compare across companies globally. So
great, makes a lot of sense. Thanks.